Hello, and welcome to this episode of Tremendous Testicles with me, your host, Danny B. History is often an obscure thing. A thing that seems so distant to us in today's world. It exists almost outside of our understanding. How can we honestly compare ourselves in today's world to societies where death was a part of their everyday lives, be it from war, which is common, plague, which is ironically enough endemic, theft or banditry, which were common forms of occupation right up until the last couple of centuries, although, if you ask some people, it's still common today. Shout out to my bankers. But through the obscure mists of time, there are stories that shine out to us, like a lighthouse in the mist, penetrating the fog of time and sending a snapshot through to us today. Which makes the subject of today's Tremendous Testicles of History all the more interesting, for it is undoubtedly obscure, having occurred, in the most part, over 5 centuries ago, at the very end of the Middle Ages in Europe, and the knock-on events from today's episode and the people involved in it would go on to give birth to the modern world we live in today. It would begin the first great era of globalization, unite the Eastern and Western hemispheres. It is the tale of the discovery of the Americas by modern Europeans, the fall of the once mighty Aztec Empire and its emperor Montezuma, and the adventures of a certain conquistador with arguably one of the most tremendous sets of testicles to ever grace God's good green earth, Hernando Cortes. Our protagonist for today's narrative was born in the year 1485 in what is today's Spain. Now, here we have an excellent segue for some context. So the reason I call it today's Spain is not just because I'm borderline retarded, it's because Spain 5 centuries ago was a very different place. Spain at the time of Hernando Cortes's birth was coming to the end of a period known as the Reconquista, which, as many of my smarty pantsers in my audience, which you all are because you're listening to me, may have guessed, Reconquista is the Spanish word for reconquest. And for 700 years, this whole of Spanish culture had been fundamentally shaped and changed and moulded by the process of reconquest. Now, reconquest from who, might you ask? Our favourite bad guys, the Muslims. The Muslim Empire, which had been founded by Muhammad, and under his successors the next 2 generations, had exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula and gone on to dominate what was left of the classical world, which had been left over after the fall of Rome. Now, the classical world was largely Christian and largely Germanic. This Muslim empire ruled lands from Persia up to the very borders of China, from India all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar and up into Spain, the land where Hernando Cortes would eventually be born. They would in fact go all the way into southern France and nearly conquer all of Europe before being stopped by a certain Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732. The reason I'm going on about this is at some point in the future I might like to do an episode about it because it's a thoroughly interesting tale, but it's a bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. So why does this matter? Well, this world of uncertainty, warfare and violence that the Reconquista created would shape the whole of Spanish culture, least of which Hernando Cortes. But more importantly, would provide the framework of how the conquistadors would treat the people they would discover in the Americas, or as they would know them, the Indies. Now, what I mean by that is the rules of engagement during the Reconquista were essentially non-existent. I mean, yes, you had Spaniards fight for mercenaries for Muslim lords, and you would have Muslims that would fight as mercenaries for Christian lords. For the most part, the only loyalty you would know is your local lord and his castle that keeps you safe and feeds you. Anyone else beyond that is untrustworthy and essentially not even a human. They're an enemy, they're out to get you. Given the opportunity, you should do whatever you can to keep them down because they're going to do it to you. The sense of treating people like this is also reinforced by religion. And you have to realize that people in this time period are essentially like ISIS is today. I don't mean they're tech savvy and have a great recruiting campaign. What I mean is that they fundamentally believe what they say. When these people say that if you fight for God, you will go to heaven, they genuinely believe that and they carry themselves as such. And when they say that the infidel is not even human and beyond scorn, that makes it a hell of a lot easier to kill every single man, woman and child when you take a city. So when the Spaniards and Europeans in general would eventually get to the New World, they would treat Indians there like they would like to treat Muslims back home, but they couldn't because the Muslims were quite good at fighting. This is why the Reconquista matters, because it creates a culture of warfare and distrust and violence that the Spaniards will carry over to them in the New World. I mean, Hernando Cortes is born when the Reconquista is still going on. Now Cortes, by all accounts, was a man of his times and something of a vagabond. Being born at the very end of these wars, as a noble squire, his parents owned a small castle, he didn't really have much to do. He didn't get to go fight the wars. So he did what most relatively poor noble people did in the time. He went to law school. Here he would remain for 2 years, drinking, womanizing, and fighting to the death. Just like all 13-year-old boys do. Motherfucker had no time to lose. After 2 years of study, Hernando had become bored with student life, travelled around for about 6 months attempting to apply his knowledge, work some jobs, bada bing, bada boom. Didn't work out, goes home to his deeply disappointed parents, and he's given a very stark choice. Go to southern Italy with the armies of Spain, fight, or go to the New World, seek new opportunities. Son, we haven't got much money left, you're going to have to pick a hill and die on it. And Hernando, bless his socks, chose the New World. Ah, yes, the not-so-new New World, the very centrepiece of today's tremendous testicles of history. I've always found it interesting to wonder how much people like Christopher Columbus knew of the Viking adventures to the New World. I mean, there were priests writing these things down. Europe wasn't, we call it a dark age, but it was relatively interconnected in ways, and I've always wondered if these stories circulated, if they became myths. Like, how much did people know of the Western land? Because it's worth noting here that people knew the world wasn't flat. Greeks, as early as the 3rd century BC, after looking at the fucking moon, had realised we're probably like that thing. Or the sun, which is also a circle thing. We're a circle thing. Okay, guys, we cleared that we're a circle thing, not a flat earth. Sorry, my people today still fighting for that cause. You got fucked up 2,000 years ago. It's over. So Europeans knew that the world was spherical, and they wanted to get to Asia, because Asia had all the nice shit. The problem is that Europeans had no idea how big the world was, they just knew it was round. So when Christopher Columbus had set off in search of wherever he was fucking searching for, he fully intended to show up in Japan somewhere. People just didn't realise that there was a whole nother 2 continents sitting in the middle of the earth. Something that is often forgotten by people is that Christopher Columbus, when he discovered the New World, didn't discover all of it. In fact, he didn't discover much. All he really found was many of the Caribbean islands, places that the Spaniards would come to know as Hispaniola. Today is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. They found Cuba, Jamaica, but they never went further west. They never knew the Americas were there. They just knew there were some big islands, and they thought maybe there's some more big islands. We don't know. We're a bit busy here right now. We've got things to do. So they never really explored more until after Cortes would arrive on Cuba. To give the man some credit, arrived on Cuba alone at 15 years old. He didn't know anyone there, he had limited training as a lawyer, and he was 15! 15, like mid-puberty, his brain was borderline, it wasn't working. And he decided to go to the New World on his own. Can you imagine a 15-year-old deciding to go to Mars, when there's like 10 people there? Cortes had arrived in the New World, penniless, with no money to his name, with no real skills. He didn't have a lot of options, but he set to work right away. Unlike many of the other arrivals to Spain's new colonies in the New World, Cortes was educated to an extent. Most people that had gone there were sailors and soldiers of the Reconquista. They were savages and they were violent, but they had no experience in governorship. They didn't understand agriculture or animals or mining or anything. So most of them would work native Indian people into the ground. They'd just work them till they died, and they'd run out of money very fast and it would just all fall over. Hernando Cortes didn't. And this is where his reputation as being history's most ruthless conquerors kind of gets into contrast, because if you look at how he treated the natives beneath him, it wasn't with contempt and it wasn't abusive. He wanted to make the most efficient economic value as he could out of his people. Instead of sending them into mines to work as slaves, he'd, again, cattle and livestock and things like that. And he quickly became one of the wealthiest people in the Spanish New World. I mean, it's always easy to brandish the Spaniards as evil and it would be better if they'd never gone, and etc, etc, and all of these things are to an extent true, but I think an important thing to remember about these early interactions between Europeans and people from the Americas is that there was no system of colonization. The Spaniards had no idea what the fuck they were doing. They just showed up to these islands, there's a bunch of people here, they don't have any weapons or anything. well, I guess maybe we should teach them about God and put them to work. That was essentially the plan, and you have to remember, how, as we've said before, these people are deeply religious, and the Pope had forbid slavery, so none of these people were technically slaves. They were all subjects to the king and had to be treated as such and had to be converted. You couldn't just use them as property. Like, this is, again, the system of chattel slavery and colonization that we think of from the 18th and 19th centuries is centuries away from existing at this point. Barbaric Europeans have discovered the New World. Like, they don't even really use gunpowder that much yet. Most of the fighting that we will talk about later on is all done with swords. For a little more about Cortes. So Cortes had become one of the wealthiest men on the islands. He was quite well connected. Things were going well. And we actually have a few contemporary reports of what he was like in his mid-20s and 30s before he became the huge human being he would be. And he would be a huge human being, boys and girls, make no mistake about it. He would fundamentally change the world. Cortes was famed for his demeanour, and here we can insert some contemporary accounts of the man and what it was said of him whilst he lived in Cuba in his mid-20s. He insisted upon being treated like a noble lord. This, by the way, was written by one of his friends. But with such gravity and courtesy that it neither offended nor appeared strange to anyone. Bernal Diaz, one of the greatest writers and adventurers of the age, he's going to receive 17 near-mortal wounds in the story that's coming up, so Bernal Diaz did not fuck around. He's frankly worth a Tremendous Testicles episode all of his own. He would describe Cortes as affable with both officers and soldiers. He felt no discomfort in the company of the high nor the low. So in short, Cortes was a great guy. He was smart, he was educated, he was funny, he was affable, people liked him, but he did have one big vice. He was a prolific womanizer. Ah yes, woman. The bane of many a great man, and of Cortes undoubtedly. Falling out of a window, because he'd climbed into that window to sleep with a local noblewoman. The husband had come home, bada bing, bada boom, tried to climb out, fell over, almost broke his back. By Bernal Diaz again, he was much given to women, and without restraint, so that being so free in other men's houses, he was always jealous in his own. Which pretty much means he fucked around a lot, and thus he expected his wife and his mates to do the same. But if there is one feature of Hernando Cortes' character that would define him more than any other, it's his decisiveness and his sheer fucking courage. He was a friendly man, and he would often seek the counsel and advice of his friends, but when it came down to it, he always backed himself. Especially with how he would obtain the captaincy of a voyage to the west, to the newly discovered lands, to the west of these islands in Cuba, where all the Spaniards, they thought it was it. Turns out there was a hell of a lot more. The tale of this first expedition to the western lands is, again, worth a Tremendous Testicles of its own, because it's a total fucking failure. 3 ships sent out with 300 Spanish soldiers on board, less than 100 made it back on 1. If you want to think, as many people do, like, oh, the Europeans conquered the New World because their technology and shit was better. Hernando Cortes is eventually going to go to the New World of 500 guys and win. This first voyage, under a guy called Veracruz, and less than 100 are going to come back. So things were by no means set in stone. It's not necessary that things had to play out the way that it did, which is why Hernando Cortes is so important. One individual can change the world, and he undoubtedly did. So anyway, this first voyage to the New World is interesting. Everywhere they stop, at first, the local people, who are markedly different to the people of the islands where they've come from. On the islands, they're like chilled out hunter-gatherers, they worship some animal spirits and shit. They're cool people. They're the kind of people you could probably kick it with today. The people on the mainland, they're kind of into human sacrifice, which is a problem. Yeah, that was quite serious. So the Spaniards, as they were sailing up the coast, started to see pyramids, which to them was shocking. They weren't expecting this, and then they realised, holy shit, there's people here that know what they're doing. They would land, they would meet the native people, and the native people straight away would just want to fight. They wouldn't want to talk, there was no parley, they would just attack them straight away. And the Spanish, they would lose a lot of people, often in their boats, just trying to get on shore. And why were they trying to get on shore? Because they'd run out of fucking water. And here, we get an interesting little connection between the first voyage and Hernando Cortes' voyage. The first voyage of Veracruz, where everyone pretty much ends up dying, is on its last legs. They stop in a Mayan city on the Yucatan Peninsula that even today we don't know. And there, they meet some native Maya people. The native Maya people, for a change, are cool. They give them some maize, they give them some water, they say, on your bike, fuck off. We've helped you out, no worries. Without all the Kiwi colloquialisms, of course, but you get what I mean. And eventually they made it home. The voyage was essentially a total fucking disaster, but they did show up with a little bit of gold, which to the Spanish was a big deal. They realised there were cities, there were people that knew agriculture, and they had gold on the mainland. And to very, very poor, barbaric, middle-aged Europeans, this was like hitting the jackpot, and they knew it. A plan was set and authorised by the king for a much more substantial expedition to the mainland to try and figure out things a little more. Great debates were held for who should captain this voyage. And Hernando Cortes, being the man of ambition and vision that he was, wanted this. And so again, beyond the scope of today's podcast, much politicking and game playing and him doing a sneaky little thing, getting in a few guys' wise, blah 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 blah. Hernando Cortes gets the captaincy of this voyage they're planning. By all accounts, organises it very well. He gets all the soldiers together, he funds and arms a lot of them out of his own pocket, gets the ships already, there's 5 of them in total, about 600 guys, about 50 horses, 12 cannon, and he gets them all onto these boats and they're getting ready to go. And then the night before his voyage leaves, a letter arrives from the governor, and he's been fucking the governor's wife. Again, like that's what I said, there's just too much here. The man's slinging dick in every direction. A letter arrives from the governor taking away his captaincy of the voyage. And this is where Hernando Cortes's first great Tremendous Testicles moment happens. Because we said before, his courage and his decisiveness is perhaps his defining factor. He is also a bit of a devious motherfucker. So when this guy shows up with the letter telling him that he's lost captaincy, he asks who else knows about this, and he says, no one. I've been told just to send it straight to you. And he's like, alright. And he stabs the man in the face. Puts him under his carpet, calls the captains to the room, says, oh shit, change your plan guys, we're leaving tomorrow, we gotta go. And so he sets off on the boats. And as he's setting off, the governor who's found out about this is riding up to the dock saying, fucking, what are you fucking, you murderer, blah blah. And you can, Cortes off the back of the boat, what's, mate, I can't hear you, mate, I'm sorry, we gotta go. We gotta go. And as you may have noticed, except for maybe a little bit about the natives, we haven't really talked about the New World and the culture there and these people. Because they are people just like us. Let's not forget that the whole way through. That these are both Spaniards and Mayans and Aztecs and everyone else. They are human beings with thoughts and feelings and emotions just like us. They might be educated different, they might come from different worlds, but same shit. The native peoples of the Americas should be fascinating to anyone that has a shred of curiosity about history, because these people developed in total isolation. People from Japan were connected to China, and China was connected to Central Asia, which was connected to Turkey, which is connected to Rome, right? So the whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Asia to Africa to Western Europe, is all interlinked by trade. The Americas aren't. These people figure out everything of their own volition. And it's fascinating to see how developed they get. They have agriculture, they have specialization, they have calendars, they have artists, they even develop a written language that we can't figure out today because, well, we'll get there, but they were very educated, intelligent people. Their culture, in many ways, mirrors the sophistication that one would see in Egyptian civilization in its birth, or early Greek civilization perhaps. In fact, the structure of the society in many ways emulates Greek culture because they're largely city-states. You have a large city with a pyramid in it and some surrounding villages that supply food and stuff, but that's the norm of political organisation, the places that will be our arena of discussion this episode. There is one area where they drastically differ from nearly all classical cultures, and that is the aforementioned human sacrifice, and it's fascinating. It really is interesting, this connection between blood and life and death and religion, in many ways mirrors certain Catholic beliefs, especially during the Spanish Inquisition. It's essentially the belief that blood is required to be sacrificed for the gods so that the world might continue. There's been floods and the sun's blown up before and blah 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 blah, and the way that we stop that is we give lots of blood. This allows for a strict hierarchy around, like we said before, artists and priests and these kind of things. It's going to make the societies that the Spaniards come into contact with extremely vulnerable to certain forms of European thinking, as we will see. So these cultures, as far as we know, stretch back to at least 4000 BC. So they're at least 6,000 years old in many parts, tracing their original culture back to the Toltecs that built a lot of the pyramids that these people will live in. It's kind of similar to Egypt in a way, where you have Egyptians 1,000 years later looking at the pyramids that had been built sort of by them 1,000 years before and kind of understanding it, but not really. Which brings in another interesting angle to this whole story, which is the story of Quetzalcoatl. Now, Quetzalcoatl is a Mayan and Aztec deity that looks eerily like a white person. And we know this from reliefs. And when I say a white person, I mean like the classical Greek, big beard, longish hair, white skin, blue eyes, features that you don't see in South America. So there was a lot of confusion by native people when they would first encounter Europeans, because they had these myths that kind of spoke of these deities, and then you come across these white folk wearing shiny metal armor, riding giant deer, shooting thunder guns. Even after Mayans and Aztecs had figured out that these guys are people just like us, they're not gods, it still had a massive effect upon their psyche. It's like if Jesus came back but he was pissed. That's perhaps one way of looking at it. So, we mentioned before a small city on the Yucatan Peninsula that helped the last group of Spaniards. Hernando Cortes figured this would be a good first stop. I've got some friends there, they're not total arseholes, I've got a guy with me that can translate, so Cortes and his 500 Spanish guys, 50 horses and some cannon, lots of dogs too, by the way. They show up to the city. It was not the reception they were expecting. They were expecting friendly and happy and stuff. These guys, when they rocked up, were in war paint, wearing war feathers with their weapons. Their weapons, by the way, to those of you that don't know, were largely edged with obsidian, which is a form of volcanic glass and still used by a lot of surgeons today. It's extremely sharp but brittle. If you're not wearing armor, you can kill people pretty easily, but against European swords, it's just going to break, as we will see. Hernando Cortes shows up with his guys, and they go and talk to the chiefs, and they say, hey guys, we can do some trading and stuff again. And the chiefs tell them for a translator, look, Hernando, I hate to tell you this, man, but after that last time, like, all of our neighbors called us a bunch of pussies for helping you out and not fighting you. This is all factually correct, by the way. You can look up the sources yourself. So that the neighbouring tribes think that we're a bunch of pussies and idiots, and we should have fought you, and we're not going to listen to their shit anymore, so we're going to have to fight. And Hernando Cortes didn't want to fight, but he thought, hey, this is a great chance to show them what we're about. They do something that is very strange to us called the Requiem, which is a weird Middle Ages legal code kind of thing where you have to say that, in Latin by the way, which almost no one spoke, if you surrender to the king and accept God, we'll all be okay. So he gets a priest to go and yell this thing out to the Mayans, who are like, okay, that made no fucking sense at all. Thanks though. And so they fight. The Spanish win decisively. Cannons and horses especially freak the fuck out of everyone, because you've got to realise their religion's built around a connection to nature and animals, right? And then you come across these people where animals respond to their commands. You know, you say come, the horse comes. You say go, the horse goes. That to people that are animalistic is a very powerful thing to witness, and would fuck with the Aztecs right up to the fall of their empire. It's something they could never really get their heads around. The Spanish win, and ironically enough, the Mayans are good sports about it. They say, hey, we were right the first time. We thought you guys were tough. That's why we were nice to you. Everyone else called us a pussy. They were wrong. You guys are tough as fuck. My bad. And so they ask the Spaniards, what would you like? The Spaniards say we would like some gold. It is worth mentioning deeply in decline at this point, and the reason why they're in decline is fascinatingly enough linked to their religion. So the Mayans, we think, had been sacrificing so many people that they'd contaminated their water supplies, because most water in Central America is held in underground aquifers, which is the same place they would throw their dead, which means eventually you end up contaminating your water supply, which means that a large city can't function, which is why you come across these massive cities in the middle of the jungle, because they ran out of water, because they poisoned everything. Interesting little fun fact, but I digress. Hernando Cortes asks for some gold, he gets given some gold, and he wants more. And he's ready to fight, like he's already fought a battle, killed a whole lot of Mayan people. He's ready to go again. The Mayan chiefs say to him, Hernando, calm the fuck down, dog. We don't have gold. There's not a lot of gold here. But they point north, and they tell him, you go to the Aztecs, that's where you'll find the gold. The Aztecs were a conquering tribe that had gone on to essentially dominate all of what is modern-day Mexico. The Mayans knew about them, they traded with them, they were their enemies, and they knew they had a lot of gold because the Aztecs loved gold. And their emperor Montezuma, at the time that the Spaniards were dealing with these Mayan people, had started to hear rumours of these strange men who had come across the ocean. These rumours, to an extent, fulfilled religious prophecy, but these people were strange. They asked for gold. They didn't do things that they would expect. There was a great deal of terror in the Aztec court, or fear or trepidation at the very least. And rightly so, based on events as we shall see. Cortes, with this information, gets back on his boats, and here we shall see the second great moment of Hernando's tremendous testicles. Hernando Cortes, upon arriving upon the beach, sets himself his task. March on Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and make the emperor bend the knee to the king of Spain. Ballsy move of just 500 guys, Hernando. Mad respect, dog. But that's his course, and so he says it to the men. Men, this is what we're going to do. And the men, they're like, fuck yeah, I'm fucking down, dog. Let's do it. And he's like, really? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, okay, burn all the ships. What? Why?
Not that keen.
Why? Well, if you're down, there's only 500 of us guys. This is not going to work unless we're committed. The Spanish soldiers, because again, they're ironically legalistic as fuck, burn all of the ships except for one. And the reason they don't burn that ship is because the king's entitled to 1/5 of all the gold they find. So they've got to take care of their main man, the king. Again, Spanish culture at this time is fucking weird. It's fantastic though. And so they burn the ship, and Hernando Cortes leads his 500 men deep into a kingdom they've never heard of, on a continent that no one's ever explored, full of people that sacrifice up to 20,000 human beings a day. The testicles on the man. Now, Cortes's adventure in the New World is too much for just one podcast. We've been talking for nearly 30 minutes, and he's just arrived outside of the Aztec Empire, which is why the culmination of the story, the battle between Aztec culture and Spanish culture, the rivalry between Hernando Cortes and Montezuma, will have to wait for the next episode of Tremendous Testicles of History.